ultimately they have slightly different agreements with every organization. So they're not all exactly the same. They're just a little bit different, but generically speaking, we can kind of talk about what that looks like and what we can do with each of those pieces. So ultimately, what happens is within each of those agreements, 12% of the funds that comes in goes to the state to cover state administrative services, the RCCA, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, and those types of things. If you ever see anything out there that says the state gets 20%, technically that's true, but we signed an additional agreement and we give 8% of that actually to the city of Chicago, and the state only keeps the 12. So for the most part, when you hear us talk about the state's portion, we're really referencing that 12%. The local governments get 25% out of the agreement itself, but when you add in Chicago's portion that came from the state, that amounts to about 33% that's going to the local governments. And that piece is really kind of important to understand, because when we're talking about local governments, for the most part, we're talking about counties, and counties are deciding how they are going to be utilizing those funds. They still have to follow the abatement strategies and the agreement requirements, but that's something that's completely outside of what we're really talking about here today, which is that centerpiece, the remediation fund. So the local governments, they are responsible for themselves and responsible for the funds and how they're going to spend the funds. And so, the state, and then of course the IRAB, which we'll talk about, has no control over that local funding. The IRAB, or the remediation fund, if you will, makes up 55% of the funds that come in. And for the most part, we're looking at grant funding there, and we're passing the funds and passing those through so that we can get those funds out into the community and get it out there where it can do some good, if you will. So the IORAB, the Illinois Opioid Remediation Advisory Board, actually makes the decisions about how those funds should be utilized. And I'll walk you through that process here in just a second. But the IORAB really has the responsibility of looking at all the different options that are out there, all the different ways that we could spend the funds, and then choosing how Illinois is going to spend those funds. So there's lots of different opportunities when you look at the settlement agreement, and certainly when you look at the state overdose action plan that's out there, there's a lot of different opportunities there as well. But the IRAB itself chooses how the funds are going to be utilized, and move those things forward. So when we're looking at the overall process, the IRAB has 3 different work groups that consider recommendations and consider ideas and consider thoughts that they will bring forward. So they have the medical and research group, we have the access and equity work group, and then we have workforce and infrastructure. And their primary goal is to come up with some innovative ways that we can utilize these funds. And on occasion, we'll also bring back items to them to consider. So somebody may bring a recommendation straight to the IORAB and say, hey, we're thinking about this. And the IORAB itself may kick that back to, let's just say, the medical and research work group. And the doctors that are primarily in that work group can consider it, talk about it, and bring forward a recommendation from there. So we have the 3 different work groups. We have the IORAB, and then any item that moves out of the IORAB and becomes a full-fledged recommendation goes to the governor's steering committee. And their role really is to look at the finances and ensure that the finances are appropriate for that recommendation. They could potentially say, for example, the recommendation is actually underfunded. Maybe they believe that there needs to be additional funds attached to it, or potentially maybe it's overfunded based upon their experience, and we may want to consider the tweaks or changes within the funding. And from there, we will want to just touch a little bit about the vision and the goals that the IRAB has. So you'll see that we have an annual report that's coming out. It's actually due out anytime now. We're expecting to have it before the end of November, but that's an important aspect so that you all can kind of get an idea not only of the vision of what the IRAB is doing, but then the goals that live underneath that vision with the 4 different RISE goals there. which will really help us work through how we're going to spend the funds in the future and how we're going to make sure that we're utilizing the funds in the best possible manner. So again, that report's on its way out, and as soon as we get it out, then I'm sure that you all will have some copies of that, and you can kind of take a look and see what you think. Well, let me walk through the recommendation process a little bit. I mentioned that work groups bring ideas forward. IRAB members themselves, of course, can bring suggestions forward and recommendations forward. But the general public can also make a recommendation. You don't have to be a member of the IRAB. You don't have to be a member of the working group. Anybody can submit an idea or a thought on how we should utilize the funds and what the best possible actions could be. The IRAB, of course, will take a look at that and then make their recommendation out of it. But anyone can start and submit a thought, submit a strategy, and kind of give us where they think that the funds should be utilized. Once a strategy is submitted, it comes to our office or my office, and then we're going to work through that and take a look at these 3 different items just to make sure that it's appropriate. First being, we want to make sure it's a general recommendation. And that just means I've had people submit ideas or thoughts that have said, please fund my organization, fund me. Or have actually said, could you fund me as a person? Can I get some of this money? And that's not the structure that we can fund and we can utilize. The IRAB has to consider generalized concepts or strategies of how those funds can be used. So anytime somebody says, give me funds or give my organization funds, we always let them know that that's not a possibility, but we will meet with them and just take a look at their thought. Why are you seeking funds? What's the concept that you have here? And is that something that we could potentially expand to the rest of the state and turn it into something that could be a generalized recommendation? We've had a couple of those that people have had really good thoughts asking for funding for themselves, but ultimately we were able to tweak those and say, let's make these recommendations that we would consider as a strategy for the entire state. And we've been able to bring those forward. The second step is to look at existing recommendations, meaning let's just make sure that we don't have something that's already out there. And ultimately, people have lots of good ideas, but sometimes those good ideas have been thought of by somebody else as well. And so we just take a look at those recommendations and we see if there's a way that we could potentially combine them to enhance the overall end recommendation, the overall final recommendation that goes forward. But if it's something that we can't enhance, we'll just let the folks know that submitted it that it's replicating an existing recommendation or something that's already out there. This includes, by the way, I don't have this term on here, but I just want to throw it out there. It includes the potential for supplanting. And ultimately what that means is when the IRAB started meeting and discussing the utilization of the funds many moons ago, they said that they don't want to supplant existing state funding. So all the utilization of the funds needs to be for something that's new or something maybe that there's a gap somewhere in the system and that we can use these funds to fund those pieces. Now, that makes us a little bit different than many other states. I won't say all of them because I don't know everybody's methodology, but you've probably seen stuff in the news about how some states, they've taken the OSF funds and they purchased, say, police vehicles, or they purchased other stuff in different ways. And ultimately, that's what our IRAB said they didn't want to do. They don't want to use these funds to buy things that the rest of the state would have paid for, or somebody else would have paid for in some other fashion. They want to utilize these funds in a different way and look at those innovative ways to engage and then fill in those gaps that exist out there. And ultimately, the final step in the process is looking at the approved uses, meaning looking at the settlement agreement itself. Make sure whatever thought or concept is coming forward is actually approved within that settlement agreement and it's something that we can fund. So as those items and suggestions and thoughts are coming through and ultimately we go through, we look at them, and then we kick those up to the point that it goes to the IRAB and gets voted on. Anything once it's voted on and it's approved from the IRAB and then ultimately by the steering committee, then it comes back to us or comes back to my office to look at the potential funding that's out there. And we have 3 different funding mechanisms that we can look at. First is just a straightforward funding expansion. So let's say, for example, we already have contracts in place for something, and the funding was just seeking to fill in the gaps, fill in where maybe state funding wasn't already paying for something, but the overall contract is already in play, and we just want to fill in the gap there. And we might be able to utilize a funding expansion based off of existing contracts. Now, I will say for the most part, those were used very initially, so we could quickly get the funds out onto in the hands of the provider, so they could do the work that needs to get done. Outside of the first year or so, we haven't really used funding expansion. We've kind of looked at the other two methodologies here. So just initially to get the funds going and get them out there. I'm not saying we won't do that in the future. There's a possibility somebody could come up with a great idea or a great recommendation that lends itself to funding expansion. But at least for now, we're looking primarily at the IGAs and the NOFOs. So the IGAs are really intergovernmental agreements. And really, this just means that super itself may not be the best state agency to handle that particular recommendation or that particular item. It might be something, for example, that Department of Corrections is better suited for, or potentially the Illinois Department of Public Health. They may have legislative authority over a particular program that has been passed. So in those scenarios, when super is not the main provider, we would negotiate an agreement with these other state agencies and pass the funds over to them so that they can then engage and get the services moving forward. And then the final one, which is the majority of the items, is the notice of funding opportunities, or NOFOs, as we call them. And NOFOs really are about getting the word out and letting everybody know that here's potential funding pieces that your organization may be interested in. You know, your site may be interested in applying for and providing these particular services. And ultimately, when we first started this process, we recognized that super itself was not going to be able to handle all the NOFOs that was coming through. And I'll show you a slide here in a little bit just to give you an idea of how many actually have come through so far. But I will say it's been 9 NOFOs that have launched since January of this year. And that represents over 150 applications that have had to have been reviewed and gone through the merit-based review process, NOFOs written up, all sorts of other steps within that process. And when we first started this, ultimately, way back in January, or when I first started engaging in this, there was really only 2 of us. It was myself and Anshul, who is our administrative assistant. And then, you know, for 9 NOFOs, that's a very small group. So we in turn negotiated a contract for a regional care coordination agency, or an RCCA. And they are the entity that assists us with these NOFOs and with launching these pieces. So I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute so you can kind of get a feel for it. But I did want to mention the abatement strategies. You can see the QR code that will take you to the settlement agreement, just in case you're interested in looking at the abatement strategies. Here we have the core abatement strategies listed, so you can see the primary things that the settlement agreement is looking for and is seeking for us to fund. There are additional strategies, again, that are part of that agreement. So you can click on either the link or use the QR code to dive in and see more and get more information about those. But those are the core pieces that we certainly engage in, and we're looking to fund NOFOs around. So I mentioned the RCCA, or the Regional Care Coordination Organization, or their overall response or responsibility, if you will, is that subawards administration. That's their primary goal. That's the primary piece that we fund them for.
So we need him to come to the South Side meeting.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did somebody ask a question?
Oh, please mute. Thank you.
So their overall responsibility, again, is that subawards administration, meaning they are responsible for developing a NOFO, or a notice of funding opportunity, advertising it, getting it out there, bringing in applications, scoring those applications using a merit-based review process that's based on what the state utilizes, and then selecting the subawardees for those particular NOFOs, or for each of the NOFOs that's out there. Once they're awarded, then they do contract negotiations, and then, of course, They're overseeing and monitoring the awards and paying the bills, if you will, as the funds move through. So that's the number one or the biggest piece. There are other two items that you may have heard about or you may see them engaging in. They are developing a website or a couple of websites for us that include dashboards and include information, because we're trying to be as transparent as we possibly can with these funds to say, here's where the money is going, here's what the money is being utilized for, et cetera. And so they are developing websites and dashboards for us so that we can do that and share that information with the general public. And then the third piece is the regional coalitions. As you can see on the map on the right-hand side there, they have 7 regional coalitions that are based on the IDPH regions of the state. So we just kind of linked our work with what IDPH had at the time that we were rolling this piece out. And each of those coalitions comes together and they meet to discuss what's going on within their region, within their local area, and what type of activities need to occur within those local areas. And we certainly recognize that the OSF funds and the funds are looking at things from a statewide perspective, but we also recognize that there's very regional and local utilizations of those funds as well. And so that's a big piece, is having those communications with the communities to understand what's missing, what are the gaps, where do we need to fill in some of the gaps within those regional areas. And I mentioned a lot of the different pieces that they engage in, but I did just want to point out here real fast. At the top right-hand side, you can see a link there to their website, or the website that they have developed for us, the ilopioidsettlements.com. The funding opportunities are listed there, as well as if you're interested in a particular NOFO and you want to see who won the award, then the CORS NOFO is a really good example here. You can always click on that CORS link and it will show you who won the awards across each one of the different NOFOs. So you can see, how much money was being utilized and where the funds have gone, and just kind of general description of what activity occurs under each one of those NOFOs. So it's good for not just if you're interested in seeking funding under a particular NOFO, but also, if you're looking for the history and you want to see who was funded, you can kind of see each of those pieces there. So going back to the settlement funds itself, just kind of give you the big picture of where we are. These funds are all negotiated out of the settlement agreements, as I mentioned before. And so you can see this is calendar year. You can see by calendar year how the funds are coming in to the state of Illinois. And more specifically, this is to the Illinois Remediation Fund. So that 55% that we've been talking about. So there's more funds that are going into the other side, but this is just about the remediation funds. The grand total in the bottom there is $772 million that is coming forward between now and roughly 2038. So a couple of things I do want to point out on this slide is we always mention that this represents our best estimate currently. And the reason I say that is there are additional settlement agreements being negotiated, as we speak. You've probably seen a few things flash up in the news lately about agreements that, were the judge rejected and sent them back and said, redo these agreements. So things like that are continuing to occur and continuing to happen. And so these numbers can fluctuate up or down, based upon what's continuing to occur over the course of time. So this is our best guess as we have it, right now. And I tend to get the question of, well, why are the numbers so different? I mean, some years you have $51 million coming in, other years you have $18 million coming in. And that's simply because of the agreements negotiated. And within those agreements, some of the organizations that are choosing to settle, some chose just to say, I don't want to spread out over the course of time. I just want to give you a lump sum up front and be done with it. Others chose to spread it out over the course of, let's say, 10 or 15 years and kind of, different organizations spread it out over different time frames and different timelines. And consequently, you end up with these numbers that kind of fluctuate up and down and kind of look a little bit different. And we've taken that into account as we were considering all of the different options and considering the NOFOs. And as you can see in the top right, what we're doing is we are capping the annual spend at $43 million, which allows us to level out those funding pieces. What we didn't want to do was have a funding or a NOFO that occurred, let's say this year, and then all of a sudden next year, because the funding plummeted, we wouldn't be able to support or fund some of the items and activities that are going forward. So we've leveled ourselves out at $43 million per year, and we can utilize those funds going forward and making sure that we have some stable funding for the organizations that are applying for and seeking to do the work. So that's a big piece of how we're moving the funds out, if you will, and getting them out into the community. These next few slides I'll be fairly quick on. I just wanted to let you see some of the funding pieces that have come through. It might give you some ideas or thoughts of recommendations that maybe you would be interested in sending forward. So I'm just always interested in broadcasting these and letting people know. And certainly if you want to see additional detail or see these again, I'll send my slides through. I'm more than happy to share the slides and you all can take a look at this, but they're also listed out on that website that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So you can get the same information from the website. But I mentioned expansion of services was really only used in the first couple of years. You can kind of see those three where we expanded services and really got the funds out there initially so we could kind of get things going. And we really haven't used that since then. For the most part, you'll see mostly NOFOs as we're shifting through. But lots of good ideas and thoughts in terms of people helping us out and coming up with good ideas. The CORE's outreach, if you will, roughly the third line there. That's really about outreach and helping individuals that have housing issues or are experiencing homelessness, and helping them to get engaged with services and get engaged with what they need to assist with their issues. The treatment for incarcerated population is a service that's being provided by the Department of Corrections. So that's one of those IGAs I mentioned earlier, that we are giving the money to Department of Corrections and they are actually performing the service. Harm reduction is kind of a mix, because we have some money that's going to the Department of Public Health and they are transferring those funds out and passing those funds out utilizing their methodology. But we also have a NOFO that has been developed and is going to be launching here by the end of the year. So we're going to have a little bit of both with that particular one, in terms of getting the funding and getting the services out into the community. And again, as we look forward, most of these, the pregnant and postpartum, warm handoff base, MAR, these all are NOFOs that have been launched, have been finished, and contracts have been signed and work is going on. I do want to point out that we are overseen, if you will, by the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, or GATA, and it requires that we redo notice of funding opportunities every 3 years. So that's why you see fiscal years 25, 26, 27 on here, because the IRAB itself will have to vote on each one of these recommendations to make the determination of if they want to continue the recommendation for an additional 3 years. Does the data not support the fact that they made changes? If so, they may choose to change and not do this particular recommendation, but do something else instead. They may choose to make some tweaks to the recommendation as it's rolled out again and re-NOFO'd. Lots of opportunities there of what could happen, but ultimately each one of these recommendations is only good for 3 years, after which time we have to either re-NOFO or get a new grant agreement, depending on how we fund that. And then our final slide there on our listing pieces, but just pointing out a couple of them. OTAC, the Opioid Training Technical Assistance Center, that NOFO is currently open. So that's something that's out there right now. If anybody has an interest or knows of an organization that may have an interest, all the information is on the website, so you're more than welcome to dive in there. But I just want to let people know that that is an open NOFO right now. We had the mobile MAR, or mobile medicated assisted recovery NOFO. We had a little bit of funds that were left over on that one. And so the second round for mobile MAR has launched as well. So it is currently available. So just to kind of throw that out there and let you know that we have those two that are available right now. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the harm reduction NOFO is going to be out by the end of the year. So we will have 3 of them basically over the next month and a half. And finally, I circle back around to, if you have an idea, if you have a thought, if you have something that you want to submit, here is both the form via link and the QR code. This is where you go to submit ideas. This is where you submit thoughts and let us know some of the great strategies and recommendations you might be thinking about. So if you've got an idea, if you've got a thought, by all means, we want to hear it. We want to hear what you've got, what your suggestions are, and take a look at that so that we can, again, make sure that we're using all the innovative ideas, filling in all the gaps, and using the funding in the best possible way so that we are having an impact on the citizens and for the state of Illinois. So with that, I will see if there are any questions or anything else that I can fill in.
Is there any questions for Jim? So I always wonder about how we can look at our blind spots. So my concern was with Black men, their drug usage, and especially older Black men above the age of 45, right? Like prioritizing them. But it seems like there's a blind spot when it comes to prioritizing Black men, older Black men, and drug usage. And then in the suburbs, it's young white men that have issues with overdoses and opioids, right? And it doesn't feel like we are intentional about addressing those two populations. And so I'm bringing that out for us to wonder about, as a group that works with people who use drugs, how to be intentional about those two groups. And then I see Vanna has a question, because that was more a comment. So Vanna, question.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation, Jen. It was really informative. My question is, I understand that any proposals that we send can not be currently funded by Super. I might have missed that. Maybe you said it and I missed it. Is that accurate? So for instance, if Super is funding recovery homes, then can we or can we not submit a proposal for the opioid settlement funds for recovery homes?
So you couldn't say, for example, let's fund recovery homes by itself. That would be supplanting the existing funding that Super already has in play, if that makes sense. But what you could do is say there's a gap. There might be something missing related to recovery homes. And I'm just, please bear with me. I'm just making stuff up at this moment, right? But if you have a recovery home and you see that there are no recovery homes that are focused around, let's say, teenagers, or adolescents, and you think that there is a viable opportunity for recovery homes focused around teenagers, then that's an idea. If that's not something that's currently funded by the state in some fashion, either by Super or by somebody else, then that's something that you could submit. So it's looking at the gaps, and anything that is funded and is connected to a funding source, we certainly cannot replicate that. But if there is something that there's a gap that's missing, or maybe something that would be helpful in support of that, then that's more than fair game, and you can submit those and bring those forward. As an example, the harm reduction piece I mentioned a little bit earlier, many people know that harm reduction is funded by primarily IDPH, but there are other pieces that are there. So harm reduction is out there. The catch to that being roughly 30% of the materials that most of the harm reduction organizations are passing out, that are handing out to individuals, aren't covered by current funding structures. So they've got a lot of materials that is being passed out that is not covered. And that's where the harm reduction recommendation that I mentioned earlier originally started, was let's see if we can cover that gap. Let's cover those pieces that are not covered by something else. So that way the harm reduction organizations aren't shelling out money that they don't really have, right? So that's an example of how you can kind of fit something in, and fill in a gap around something.
All right, Jim, we got 5 questions here. So, and you have a short amount of time, so we're going to go through this quickly. So Pastor Mac, your question for Jim.
Thank you, Jim, for the presentation, and good day to everyone. My question is around the creativity of NOFOs. When you had opened up the idea of people submitting ideas, can you just give a brief, maybe have you seen something where faith-based have connected to this, and maybe something that you saw was very creative?
All right, Pastor Mac, something creative from the faith-based community.
Yeah, I can say I can't really, I'm trying to do this from memory. I don't really recall one that's directly from the faith-based community. But I do want to be very careful and make sure that, because I did have this question in an earlier meeting, that does not mean that the faith-based community can't apply. They certainly can apply to these NOFOs. But I don't recall any recommendation off the top of my head that went through that from a faith-based community. But so if you have ideas, by all means, submit those. We'd be more than happy to take a look at those.
Perfect. All right. We have John.
Hey, everybody. Good to see folks. Jim, I had just a follow-up question about the harm reduction money. And if you could talk a little bit more about the transferring over to IDPH, and then will that money be entirely managed by IDPH, or is IDHS still going to be the main organization overseeing those funds? Or I know that the NOFO will be done by IDPH. I hope this question makes sense, but just I could use a little bit more details about who's going to be managing that money. And then, of course, if you could maybe give us some more details about timeline on when that money you think is going to be available. I think you might have made a statement about it, but I came in a little bit late, so I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, so timeline, the NOFO for the harm reduction NOFO is split into 2 different pieces. That might be what you missed a little bit earlier. So part of the money is going to IDPH and part of it's going through a NOFO that we are launching. Our NOFO is launching by the end of the year. So it will be out by the end of December for sure. So, and that represents the majority of the funds, roughly, I'm giving you an approximation. That's approximately $14 million of that's going to be through that NOFO coming out by the end of the year. The $1 million approximately that's going to IDPH, that will be managed again by their side and by their process. So I can't really give you a timeline on that. I'm not sure about their timeline. Oversight of that is similar to an agreement with any other organization. So they have data specs that they have to meet, that they have to provide, and then we'll pull those data points back in and be reporting out on those, just like if the contract was with anybody else.
All right, Dr. Jenny.
Thank you, Jim. So just a question about how determination is made on the per award cap. So for instance, I can imagine there being, very ambitious projects, for instance, Housing First, right? Like Canada, for instance, tried out a Housing First model that was across 5 sites. It cost the nation $110 million, right? So, I can imagine some bold, very important, for instance, housing related interventions for people who use drugs can have a pretty large sticker price. So how are determinations made as to sort of do you have, caps, or is it entirely dependent on the strategy when you determine award sizes?
It's really dependent on the strategy itself. So we try to do some research into what other organizations, whether it's the state or other places, have utilized, and kind of dive in from there. So I don't think I really discussed this a little bit earlier, but I just want to throw it out so everybody has an idea. The $43 million that we have on an annualized basis, ultimately what happens is if we don't utilize all of those funds, so let's say we have a year where we only utilize 35 million, the remaining 8 million goes into a one-time investment that we would then re-NOFO. So that allows us to separate out the annualized investments versus the one-time investments and keep them kind of in separate pots. They're not different funds, just to be clear about that, but separate pots in our own mind, if you will. Because we always want to look at, there are some things we're going to fund on an ongoing basis for 3 years and maybe even longer. There's some things that are going to be one-time funded, and that's going to be the end of it. And that's kind of how we're separating those pieces. So ultimately, we have the capability of looking at housing, if you will, all sorts of variations of housing, low barrier shelters, all those types of things. We can look at those and may have potentially higher numbers for those pieces because we'll use anything that wasn't spent otherwise to fund those pieces on a one-time basis.
Great question. Wanza Lee. Yes.
Hey, I have two questions, but my first question is in line with what Pastor Mack asked in regards to faith-based. Do you guys plan to do anything around that, create a NOFO around faith-based or faith-based initiative? Because that's one of the things that I know that we've been talking about, and actually Super has been pushing, and we've been approaching a number of the churches, and I think I just think it would be something that would be really good, that would be helpful. That's the first thing. My second question is, can you be a little bit more specific when you talk about harm reduction funds for harm reduction? Because the task force is receiving funds around harm reduction. What's the difference between the grant that we received around harm reduction and the one that you're talking about that is coming out at the end of the year?
So for the first question, I would say submit your ideas and your thoughts and let us know, because ultimately that's one of the things I think is a little bit of a misnomer, that people think Super is coming up with all these ideas. We aren't. We're taking your ideas. We're taking your thoughts and bringing your thoughts forward and trying to utilize those. So if you've got a faith-based idea, send it to me. We want to grab onto those and we want to bring those forward so they can be considered. For the harm reduction piece, there's probably a couple of different answers, and it might get a little complex. So I'm just gonna, kind of summarize at a high level and just kind of say that, and if I'm off on this in terms of your funding, I believe that the funding that you have currently is actually through cannabis funds. I could be wrong about that, but I believe it's cannabis funds. Yeah, and that's the difference. And ultimately, the reason it's through cannabis, just so you all know, is cannabis existed before the opioid settlement funds. And so you were funded out of cannabis first.
Okay.
And when there was a discussion with the IRAB, that kind of circles back to the whole supplanting discussion. They said that there's already funding for this out of cannabis. So we don't want to supplant that. We want to utilize these funds for other initiatives and not supplant something that's already being funded. So that's part of the piece there. So and then outside of that, I can't really say a whole lot about the harm reduction NOFO that's coming out, because I don't want to violate any rules. If I give you all any extra hints by accident, that could prevent you from applying, and I don't want to do that. So, but I will say, like I said, it's going to be coming out before the end of the year. So keep an eye out on that website that I listed, and keep your eyes open because it's coming.
All right, we have one more question, Ms. Davis.
Thank you for your presentation and your response.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Jim. Thank you so much. I'm new to the world, so I'm learning and soaking up a lot. And so thank you for that. Quick question, one about the NOFO for, and this is why I say I'm new, so everybody forgive me, the little one here. Is it considered a good idea if multiple organizations partner on a particular gap, or do we apply separately? Feel free to. That's my question.
You could do it either way. With the only, I want to be careful and make sure we run that caveat to say that it really depends a lot on the NOFO and what the issue is that you're diving into, right? But it's more than acceptable for multiple organizations to apply themselves or to come together as a group.
I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. Is it possible to come together as a group? There's a particular gap, we're all noticing it, and those partnerships that have alignments or linkages or MOUs, is it possible to apply as a multi-facility group?
You could apply as, you could apply as a group. There's multiple ways you can do that. So for example, an organization could apply and then subcontract with everybody else. You all, I mean, I'm not a legal expert, so consult your lawyers. That's number one. But yeah, you all could form a new entity, if you will, in the terms of a new legal entity that maybe could apply. I mean, there's options of things that you could do there. And so I don't, yeah, it doesn't have to be each organization applies for their own funding. It could be that, 10 different organizations come together and apply for funding and to get that. Again, caveat being a little bit depending on the NOFO, there might be some restrictive NOFOs for some reason. But globally speaking, you don't have to say, well, you have to apply and I have to apply and we'll have to be separate. I mean, you all could come together.
All right. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate your presentation. We all got some good information here. The reason why I wanted it is because we are able to submit our ideas that we have, that we see gaps in services to the board, and then they get to take off with it and see if it comes back to us, and then we can get our ideas out there. So our next presentation is from
Vanya,
Dr. Kim.
let
Yes.
me, Vonna had a question there. Jim, can you take a look at the question from Vonna and maybe you could answer in the sidebar or in the chat if we could do that? Thanks.
Oh, sure.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. All right, Dr. Wah.
All right, thanks, Fania. I'll try to make this quick. So first bit of update for everybody. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jenny Hua, Medical Director for Behavioral Health at the Chicago Department of Public Health. Yeah, so first bit of update. We had a HAN alert go out on the 8th. I hope you all had noticed. I wanted to use this opportunity to kind of give everybody an overview of what this was about. So we had a cluster of patients hospitalized from Humboldt Park, all with overdoses that were difficult to reverse with naloxone. So a couple of them, at least one, but potentially two, required intensive care even after multiple doses of naloxone were administered. Our partners at Chicago Recovery Alliance were able to receive some of those substances, so the drugs associated with this cluster of overdoses, sent them out for testing. They came back testing positive for fentanyl. But in addition, and this is very important to underline, we also detected 4 different types of nitazines, including empirolidinol protonitazine, which is 25 times more potent than fentanyl, as well as trace amounts of medetomidine, as well as the novel adulterant BTMPS or BTEMPS, which has been cropping up across the country as a novel adulterant, in various jurisdictions since June of this year. So this is the first time that this has been detected in Chicago. We think that very likely the symptoms were due to the nitazines rather than any of the other components, just because there were 4 different types of nitazines present, even though they were present in trace amounts, as we've been seeing. So I want to emphasize that usually when nitazines are detected, it's not in a humongous quantity, right? But as we're seeing the purity of fentanyl or the concentration of fentanyl go down in drug supplies across the country, including in Chicago, the percentage of drugs that is testing positive for nitazines has been going up, right? So, and I don't know if Taylor is on the call, but they can kind of give you a sense of what data they've been seeing at CRA, right? So, last that we've sort of looked at this information, around 28% of all substances tested, which were sold as dope, tested positive for nitazines. So it's a concerning trend, to be sure. We are stocking nitazene test strips, which were shown to be fairly sensitive to all of these different types of nitazines we eventually confirmed the presence of. So we are distributing those freely. If you send us an email, fill out a request form, you can ask for nitazene test strips and obtain them. You can also order them for yourselves to distribute for harm reduction purposes, and that's all highly recommended. The BTNX nitazene test strips turned out to be quite sensitive, and we're on the mark this time around in terms of the picking up the nitazines that were found in the drugs. So, and then, you know, if there are any questions about either nitazines or BTMPS, I'm happy to answer those. I'll just pause there before I sort of move on to my next set of updates to see if there are any questions. All right, everyone feels comfortable. All right, so then my next set of updates is really to alert you all to the Summer Opioid Response Executive Summary. Oh, I see a hand up. James, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, sorry, Dr. Hart, thank you. I have a question. I've been tracking fatalities through the Cook County Coroner's data that they publish online, and seeing a sharp decline in 2024 relative to 23. And we're speculating about why is that. And one of the things you mentioned is one of the things we've been thinking, that fentanyl availability has been decreasing nationally, I guess, and in our area. Would you think that that might be one of the reasons we're seeing I mean, other than all the good work that people are doing, getting naloxone out there.
Yes.
Did you have any thoughts about that?
Yes,
I don't know
I
if you're
think
seeing the same
that is
thing.
the strongest contributor. I mean, not to say that all of the work that we're doing is not making a difference. I think it is, right? So, and I should mention that the fatality numbers year on year has been declining since 2022, right? So we've been on a downward trajectory, but the sharpness of this recent downward trajectory for Cook County is more than likely due to drug supply changes.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? If not, I do want to, okay, let me see. Send to everybody in the meeting, this Summer Opioid Response Executive Summary. You know, I think it would be good for everybody to kind of take a look. It does summarize all of the activities that has been going on over the summer, you know, including community-based drug checking. This is the executive summary. We'll have the full report out probably by next month. So as you can see, you know, we have the hotspot map. This is sort of our, if you want to look at our most up-to-date hotspot map, this would be it, covering all of 2023. And it kind of goes over the 5 components of our summer response, including Operation SOS, which our partners at Westside Heroin Opioid Task Force has been doing a stupendous job at. And, you know, so in less than a month and a half, outreach workers basically met over 1,000 individuals. At this point, Westside Heroin Opioid Task Force has gone door knocking, canvassing across all of Austin, and I think you've all started moving into Garfield Park. Over 2,500 encounters, individual encounters, distributing Narcan and our harm reduction tote bags that contain an array of city and community-based resources. So all of those materials, as well as information encounters, have gone out. You know, over 80%, probably close to 90% in favor of locating an overdose prevention site on the South Side. So this is all very important work that continues to unfold through Operation SOS, which launched over the summer, and the steady drumbeat goes on for the rest of the year. We want to highlight the fact that we distributed over 10,000 naloxone kits. That's actually excluding what, so this should be, you know, more like 12,000 naloxone kits. If we combine all of the distribution that we've been doing through the rest of the governmental and community-based partners, in addition to Operation SOS, over 40,000 fentanyl xylazine test strips over the summer month. Also, we've seen a rise over the summer with calls in the Miao hotline. So again, emphasizing that you can call anytime to the Miao Illinois helpline, right? And these calls went up significantly, especially from Chicago from May to August. And also our community coordination meetings. You know, I think we'll have, I don't know, Fania, an in-person event sometime.
I hope so.
Sometimes next month,
Exactly.
just to celebrate all of the milestones that we've been seeing this year. So yes, overdose, both emergency responses and fatalities have been down. Year on year in January and August, from 2023 to 2024, we're down about 19%. If we're looking just at the summer months, it would be 23% for just the summer months. So, we've basically successfully flattened the curve. So some of you who've been in other meetings with me probably heard me talk about this already. So apologize if I sound like a broken record, but I think there's a lot of important work that needs to kind of be strengthened. But we also did achieve quite a bit. So I want to celebrate that because it's all of you. It's all of you doing this work. All right, that's all for me.
Thank you. If you have questions for Dr. Junie, please reach out, email her. She's very responsive. But we have to move on to Above and Beyond. Director of Outreach, Sada Davis, if you can talk about your services and Above and Beyond.
I'll be very quick. I've lost my timer here. Hi, well, hello everyone. I'm Saudia Davis. I like that pun, doctor. We'll see what happens. My sister's a doctor. I'll work on my PhD. But I am Saudia Davis, the director of outreach for Above and Beyond. I come to this work with my own personal history and story because of the enriched presentations today. I'm going to jump really fast. All of you may have been into Above and Beyond or may not recently, and I welcome you to step into our living room. I stepped into Above and Beyond in 2018 and was building a theater, the Heroin Center for the Arts on the west side of Chicago in Austin, and was introduced to Above and Beyond to sort of circulate where we could make sure we were tapping all of our communities on the west side for resources. And I tell you, having stepped into Above and Beyond in 2018 and now in 2024 is absolutely brilliant and growing in tremendous ways in the way that we are meeting people where they are. And that speaks to ROW. That is our Recovery on Wheels vans. We now have 2 for our 2942 location at Lake in Sacramento. And when we say meeting people where they are, that means that our Recovery on Wheels van are going out into encampments. Speaking of the parks, right, Doctor, how you just mentioned Humboldt Park, we have Garfield Park, but we also go out to our partners in facilities where individuals who are seeking shelter. And we are able to bring them to Above and Beyond. I should be clear about Recovery on Wheels, meeting people where they are. We just are launching we've launched our coat drive. This is an example of Recovery on Wheels. We will disseminate all of those coats, boots, all of the things on Black Friday. So a lot of people think we receive the merchandise and things we do, but we actually take it out. So we take things out to those who are our clients, but we also bring them to us. We have a tremendous team of individuals. I'll give one example. Let me look at the time. I have 2 minutes. Okay, I'll try to be quick. So we have both women and men on both of the Recovery on Wheels so that we are actually representing who we are so that there's no harm potentially in who we're approaching, if that makes sense. We're very sensitive. The individuals, our CRSS team and Recovery on Wheels specialist are very sensitive to how they speak to individuals. And one example is last week, I'll use her name, Sharon, was explaining that there were a group of individuals in an encampment while they were moving one of our clients into housing. We had placed in housing. She said they had a lot of things, right? Things that you wouldn't even imagine, but they were transitioning from being unhoused into a facility. And while Sharon and one of our other CRS were assisting, some of our Recovery on Wheels van specialists were touching base with the individuals who were kind of standing around and watching. And they generally are very resistant to giving any of their information, but what they did end up sharing is that they were actually just fearful of being judged and fearful of being judged about talking to individuals. So the Recovery on Wheels are a tremendous group of individuals who go out into the community. They're nurturing the environment. We practice harm reduction, and we're allowing them to understand that we are a welcoming space, but we also provide resources and we take them to them as we meet people where they are. So again, I'm Saudia Davis. Thank you for allowing me to introduce myself to you. I'm more interested right now in all of the 42 people who are on this call. So by all means, I look forward to meeting you in person soon. Thank you so much for all of the work that we do. Yes?
All right, thank you. She's going to be reaching out to all of us and touring our spaces. So please welcome her to the team. We don't have a lot of time left. Does anybody have any member announcements? I'm going to save next time we meet, we can do new people in the room. So is there any important announcements that anybody needs to make at this point in time? All right, be looking for a gathering in December from CDPH. I'm gonna let you go. It is now 2 o'clock exactly. All right, thank you guys. Thank you for all the presenters today. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. I'll stay on for a couple of minutes to see if anybody has anything they need to say. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Huggett.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Vanya, really quick, I put my information in the chat, but someone said if I could put my information in, I wonder if it went directly to one person.
So what?
We'll share your email maybe?
Yes.
No,
So what?
It's there. It's there. At 101, it's there. All the good.
Perfect.
You'll
and
find
also too, when people come in late and come out, sometimes they lose the information. But also too, what we do is we send out the recording and we'll send out the notes for this meeting. So so
Beautiful.
everybody gets that. All right. Thank you.
All right. See you.
Right, good seeing you.
Bye-bye.
All right.
See you tomorrow.
All right. See. Yes. All right. Any questions? Ann, Sophia, Erica, Phoebe, did y'all just walk away from the room? All right. All right.
Have a good day, everyone. Be
All
encouraged.
right. Think about a good idea to submit, Pastor. If you need help, let us know, because I think a recommendation coming from the faith community would be awesome.
I agree with you, and I think
Yeah.
we should maybe think about something collaborative too, right?
Yeah.
So see how we can figure this out. So I'll reach out to you and we'll start brainstorming.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
You're
We're in
welcome.
permanent
Pastor.
brainstorm mode always.
Always brainstorming.
Tim, what was that? What was that background there, Tim?
Oh, that was from our group over here. Good, positive feedback.
I was like, no, it's like you had like fireworks behind you.
I've got my mic on. Yeah, or off. I had it off, but yeah.
Great meeting.
Yeah, wonderful.
Good information.
Great work.
Thank you.
Excited.
I'm leaving. See ya.
All right. I'm leaving. All right, guys. Thank you.
Take care, Lee. Good to see you as well.